welcome back to the Athlete's Edge podcast. Today we're going to talk about how to structure your week to make speed the priority, how to structure a speed session, and some general advice around speed training. So if we get stuck into it, Tim, how would you structure your week to make speed the priority?
I think if we start with how many sessions we should be looking at, and then we can maybe unpack a bit more where that would fit in. So I think I would be aiming for between 1 to 2 sessions per week. The reason being, when we look at actually the decay of speed, if we think, I guess, more than 1 session per week, we know that speed sort of starts to go backwards, if you like, after around that 2 to 7 days. So if you think sort of, even obviously 2's not many days, but around that sort of week, just under a week, if we're not exposing ourselves to some really high quality speed exposures, then we're potentially starting to lose some speed. And that's not because the physical qualities decay that quick, it's the coordination side. And I think that's the big thing people forget. Unless they've done it and had a break and come back, then you really feel it. And like, oh, that, I can sprint, but it just feels really foreign. It's hard to put the forces, the timing of all the what the knee, the hip, the ankles doing, what your arms, or your core, and all the muscles in between that drive the movement. It's hard to put all that together in split seconds. It's a very high coordination based activity, and I think we underestimate that.
And so what kind of gets in the way of speed development? I know we've just had a chat to our athletes this morning around the 2K and that kind of being the priority at this time of year, and everyone's sort of stressing about that. But what sort of actually gets in the way?
Well, I think that's the wrong priorities, in my opinion. So if we sort of say, well, I can't fit 2 sessions in. It's like, well, 1 will maintain. Maybe if you're slow, will increase speed to a degree, but you'll find that even 1 gets hard because, like I said, for some, it's decaying in that 2 to 5 days. So if you're not frequently exposing yourself to, the skills and the forces and, the ability to run fast, then you're not getting better. So I guess what we spoke about this morning was the issue with speed training is it's to run a PB with your sprint time. It's a thing you've probably never done before. If it's a personal best, you definitely haven't done it before. So it's a brand new skill each time you achieve that. Why do people like conditioning more and all this talk around 2Ks and stuff? Well, I think it's because anyone can make someone tired, but if you can run 100 meters, you can put 100 meters back to back to back and make a conditioning session, because none of it on its own is that hard. It just is, if you do enough running with a short enough rest, it gets tiring. And because it's tiring, you think you're working on something. You're telling yourself that I'm busy and I'm tired and stuff, so I must be getting better. But often we see it's better at the wrong things. And in a lot of our situations, we see it actually doesn't improve things like your 2K time. Because I still think they're training the wrong thing. Doing running at sub-max intensities doesn't necessarily make you more efficient. And we spoke last week around the VO2 max stuff and that. So if you're unsure, that's a bit more the endurance chat. That was last week. So first of all, they're not making the time to get 1 or 2 in. Then when they are, because it's not the priority, they're carrying too much fatigue into those sessions. So if we look at where they should fit in the week, ideally, so for us, we do Tuesday, Thursday morning. It's not ideal having only 2 sessions, which we will be changing in the new space. But ideally, it's not after a big session Monday or Wednesday night, because then you're carrying that fatigue 12 hours, from the session 12 hours previously, and it's not going to lead to your best results that morning. Now, because of our situation, I do still encourage that people try and find the time to get there on one of those. And that's where it just might be the expectation around I might not be PBing every week. It's still just doing the drills and doing the speed exposure. Even if it is at not quite their best, is it better than nothing? Probably. And that's why our gym matches up a lot of the speed stuff. Like we target not so much the classic gym program. We do enough of our plyometrics. Like we've got a velocity block in the warm up, so we're trying to get some plyometrics and exposures to some faster ground contacts in our warm up that we do every gym session. We work on a lot of like the ankle stiffness stuff and a lot of our core work, which typically aren't in a lot of classic gym programs, because we sort of are trying to prepare athletes for speed, not just to get them strong.
And where does the gym fit in, and how does that transfer to the track?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think if we look at the gym, even though I'm talking there about some of the exposures to some fast contacts and some speed type movements, it is still very general, as in it's not specific to speed. It's not specific to football and netball and swimming and water polo, all these sports. What it does do though is build the hardware to make athletes better at their sport when they get there, as well as capable of doing more training in their sport. So we spoke about like sport training being more net negative on the body, the gym building up muscles and tendons and joints a bit more net positive, so it offsets a lot of the fatigue and the stress that sport creates. But it also builds that bigger engine, so more force production, better energy, return from braking phases into propulsive phases because of better muscle strength and coordination and tendon strength and health. So it's very much around that sort of structural integrity, I guess. Whereas the speed, while there's elements of that, because speed training, like we know, sprinting is very similar to Nordics at creating strong and lengthening the hamstring muscle because of the load sprinting puts on the hamstrings. Hence why people that don't do it properly get hamstring strains. But I think of speed a lot more around like the timing, so the coordination, the firing patterns of how to put all these positions and movements together to be able to accelerate and build a really good sprint.
And so how do we actually structure a speed session? So I know a lot of people, I've been guilty in the past, where you kind of do your research, you kind of look up some general stuff and you try to implement it, but how should it actually look?
If I go a little bit more maybe too far, I guess more like at the coach level and how I think about it, and then you can ask maybe some questions if we need to simplify it. I think we talk about warm-up. Yes, the point of the warm-up is to warm up the body, but I think we don't need like 2 laps to do it. We can start with a lot of the movement prep that we want that will help the actual session. So either the movements we're doing or, like acceleration or top speed or change of direction, whatever the focus is going to be primarily, a lot of our movements can still match that while we warm up. So I think of a warm up as a bit more like movement prep for the session, less about a warm up.
Let's run through some examples. So if we were to go through a change of direction, max velocity and a acceleration warm up, what are some general exercises that you typically see or use?
Well, instead of say running up and down or running a lap, it might be like, well, okay, so what's the point of that? Heart rate up and getting some blood going in the muscles and getting the muscles, tendons of the legs working. We might do more of let's go into just a body weight split squat and let's work on, just working through some range there. And so you're getting a bit of a stretch through the hips, you're getting the leg muscles working, obviously you're getting your heart rate up a little bit. Then we might progress that into more of some forward lunging, because we're going to, in a second, work through some deceleration stuff. And while I'm doing the lunging, I'm already starting to look at and cue, what the foot's doing, so that when we get into it with a bit more speed, I've already sort of coached the parts that I know I'm going to have to coach, with more intensity and more speed on the body, so that hopefully there's already improvement in some of the technique before we get there. And so that would be the start of the session. And then I would look at getting into, so we go through our movement skills, and that is typically say some lunging. If we're going to do some change of direction, like you said, we might do a grapevine, stuff like that, because we're looking at hip rotation and as I'm doing that, watching athletes like who's tight, who can't rotate, who can't get the that hip function to a level they're going to need to do to perform a change of direction well, before we've even got to the actual part of the session that he's working on, what we said we're going to work on. Things like then we'll probably go through our plyometrics. So typically I go linear, lateral, linear. On a change of direction day, it's usually going to be lateral, linear, lateral. So we've got lateral being side to side type movements, linear more straight line. So we still got some of that in there, but I'm going to have more of a focus on some of the change of direction type ones. So whether that's some lateral shuffles, whether that's a crossover drill, whether that's some lateral bounding, stuff like that will be in the session to warm up, keep warming up, but to potentiate, to work on, some power development, to work on some of the skills that we're going to see. So hopefully what the point I'm making here is you can see each drill is not doing one thing. Each drill we're trying to tick 2 or 3 boxes every time we put a drill in. And I think, like you said, the big mistake is people sort of grab stuff, and it's not necessarily bad stuff, but it's like, is that the most efficient use of your time? Probably not. And I think this is what people are paying for, in that you're getting probably 3 to 4 times the results you would on your own, at least, because we've done this before and we're condensing a lot of that and saving you a lot of wasted time on things that don't help or maybe make you worse.
And so if we were to sort of progress from the warm-up to the actual sort of main block and the main session, can you walk us through, even, for example, this morning session and maybe the reasons why you chose certain exercises and structured it in certain ways?
So typically there will be some skill type drills, because in our space we're obviously not dealing with elite track athletes. They're field sport athletes first, trying to get faster. So we take a lot of, track and field type drills and use them to teach skills over time. So things, for example, today, like our like the power skips, I really like as a version of trying to overload the power off the ground. There's still an element of ankle stiffness. We talk a lot about the hip lock that you got to get up in the air, because what we see a lot with our kids when they sprint is they lose control of those things, like the foot and how it interacts with the ground isn't great, so they leak a lot of force there, and their hip control and their pelvic control often gets a lot out of whack as soon as they try and build some speed. Therefore, they're not able to generate the same amount of force. So they're not generating the power through their hips, which drive most of the movement, and then they're leaking what they do generate through the floor. Another version of that, like we had today in our top speed block, was the dribbles. So dribble builds into a knee dribble, and holding that for 25 metres helps. It's a form of movement forward, but it helps to sequence, at high frequency, that leg action we want to see with really good front action. And because it's fast and they're moving quick, they've got to be really quick on the ground. Because typically what we see is when kids try and run fast, they over push and spend too much time on the ground, which then throws their mechanics sort of breaks it down, and that's why we see their speed potential really diminish, as well as their injury risk potentially go up, because we know that links to things like hamstrings and even chronic knee issues and lower backs and groins and even shin splints. Like all that stuff, I think in a big way comes back to how the foot hits the ground and what the hip sort of functions doing. When we do get into our sprints, so often we do that as 2 groups, and typically I'll do our faster guys first, because that's sort of like the back end of their warm-up, if you like, before they get into some max effort excels. And then we'll do some high intensity sprints. So some keys here is it's timed. So we've got the gates out, there's feedback, because that creates this competition and drive within that person and amongst each other, but I'm not as worried about that. They know their time and they're trying to compete with themselves. And I think that's massive when we want 95% or more effort for that person on any given day, within reason. Yeah, like I said, with a bit of fatigue or soreness or something, then we're modifying. But we want that effort. To get that, the second thing is rest times. So the big mistake is, sprint, 10, 15 seconds rest, sprint back, or sprint, jog back, sprint, jog back. I know from the timing gates, from GPS at training sessions, you do not get anywhere near. Like if you're at 80% of your top speed, you're doing well at that method. They think they're going, because they're going all out. It's not a lack of effort. They're trying their hardest, but fatigue means they don't get the output. And that's probably the mistake. So for us, it's walk back, it's wait a minute in the line. So for a 10, 15 minute sprint, we want at least a minute's rest, if not 2.
And so even, I remember you brought up Usain Bolt and his, and Giacca even, and their training schedule and how that looks and how they prioritise their speed and how actually short the sessions are.
Yeah, like I've heard of Usain Bolt doing stuff like 360s, and it's 20, 30 minutes rest between each one. We might do a little bit of table work and a bit of stretching, drilling and stuff in between, but it's rest, max output. Because obviously at that level, the gap between crazy, fastest ever versus 100-meter final to not making the final is very, very small. He talked about training like 10 years for 0.1 or 0.4 of a second or something. Like lots of investment for very small return. And like listening to Gout, I think he might have been interviewed by Noah Lyles, another incredibly fast man, talking about his acceleration day was something like a 30, 2 20s and 3 10s. That's it, out of the blocks. So hugely intense, but to get the quality, the volume can't be there.
And so for local athletes who have footy training or basketball training or whatever it is, how can they somehow include and structure speed into their own sort of warm-up pre-training? Because from my experience and going through it, not many warm-ups actually athletes hit top speed. A lot of it is, like you said, that sort of work to rest ratio isn't great. You do a 60-metre stride, you turn around, you go again, and everyone's probably, again, at that 80% where it feels hard because you're trying and it's, intense, but that output isn't there. So how can people actually do some simple run-throughs or whatever it is to...
I think you sort of half answered it there. I think doing it at the start of training, before you get fatigues, don't do it at the end. And if you're not 100% sure it's going to be in your warm-up, this is where you can take ownership. We're talking small volumes here. So we're talking 4 to 5 reps is enough of 10, 15 metre sprints to really work on that acceleration. So what I would say is, you get to train a little bit earlier, you're probably doing a bit of a warm-up and probably wasting 15 to 20 minutes, make it count. So, do a bit of a warm-up, get moving, and the easiest way to do it without having to overthink drills and stuff is just to set out your distance, 20 metres for example, do, easy jog, walk back, do it a little bit faster, walk back, do it a little bit faster, walk back. You might then still, or before it, after it, do a little bit of stretching, might go into your skill work, again, before or after, whatever works for you, but there's really no excuse not to do it. It fits nicely before training because it's going to be a day where we'd call a high stress or high fatiguing day. So it makes sense to do it then before the session, because the problem with the next day is you're going to carry fatigue into that next day. So it does work quite well before training. And it's just about keeping it simple and just doing your run-throughs. And the key there is, though, if you can't time it, you're not going to get that direct feedback, but you are going all out. Like I said, for at least those 3 efforts. Give it everything you got.
And if we go and sort of pivot to a coaching perspective and how they sort of design and structure their conditioning sessions, what are some key considerations that they need to make for your sort of hybrid guys, your aerobic guys, your anaerobic guys?
In terms of conditioning itself, I guess if we keep it the speed focused first, is what I've found is your really high speed guys and typically lower fitness, they don't test as well in their 2K. The mistake we often make is I think we see 2K result and think, okay, this isn't going to work, we need to make these guys fit. As a result, they take away their superpower and potentially break them, get them injured, because they give a really fast twitch, high speed guy too much volume. So what I've done in the past is if we had, say, 3 groups, so your really high speed guys fit in that first group, they would do more like your tempos. So they're going, 13, 14 seconds, 90, 100 meters, and they're getting 45 plus seconds rest. So they're going on the minute. And they're probably, so they, as a result, do a lot less volume. Your hybrid guys are probably decent speed, but pretty good endurance. They typically suit a bit more of that classic sort of interval type stuff. And that's whether that's 15, 15, 30, 30, 20, 20, 15, 30 or 30, 15. That's just, how you work your progressions. Then you'll find you're probably maybe not as fast, your real grinders, but very good aerobic guys. They can do more your 3 to 1, 2 to 1. So, I remember one Bushy's pre-season we had, Darcy and Connor Sullivan in the same group, both, sort of sub 6 or just on 6 minute 2Ks. So they would be doing, 3 minutes, 90 minutes, 90 seconds on, 30 seconds off. Because of their aerobic abilities, they recovered too quick to do 15-15s. Whereas on the other side, because the other guys are very fast twitch, their body handles energy differently, therefore fatigue really quickly. So even 15-15 just shattered them. They found it really, really tough. And I think the mistake we make there is we go too much into, well, let's change them to be more aerobic, when I would argue that they're the guys with a really nice quality that's really hard to get. And let's let football make them fit, not conditioning.
And so we kind of transitioned to a bit more of a rehab point of view. You shared a reel on speed as a skill at different speeds from Stu at Altus, which you've kind of discussed before. So say an ACL or hamstring even. And yeah, why does that frustrate you so much?
Yeah, so Stu was talking about like a different speed that's different skills. And so the common rehab approach is return to run some laps, jog. And then we build, okay, well, let's just do a little bit more and a little bit quicker. And then it's like, okay, now let's add some speed in. The problem is if you go from jogging to then let's add speed. So say they're getting through that really well, that's great. But I would argue that you still haven't done anything to prepare for this, because it's a different skill. What I take from track and field, what they do well is they have versions of the drills that is speed. So like we're saying is like, for me, my progressions are skipping, switching, dribbles, sprinting. They're all max intensity, but the drill is just a lot easier at the skip level. Like Geordie can skip at 4. So, okay, you're not doing that day 1 after an ACL, but you can nearly do that at day 3 or 4 after a hamstring, because you're locked in and it's a short range, assuming there's no tendon involvement or anything. But what they do is they do this slow jogging, haven't worked on the sprinting pattern at all, because like I said, it's a different skill, but assume jogging is a progression to sprinting. I would say we should separate walking, jogging, striding, and sprinting as 4 different activities. But I think we just assume that they're a progression when they're not. It's a progression in speed, but it's not a progression in the exercise. We see it a bit in the gym in terms of like a squat and like a single leg squat. They're both squats, but they're both very different because the coordination and the muscles required are different. So yes, the quad drives a lot of it, but when you go to single leg, now the hip stability is massive and the ankle range is massive because you can't sort of lean forward as much and overload through the hip. So it becomes different. And we've seen guys that can squat really well bilaterally can't do bodyweight single leg, and vice versa, because they're different. They're a quarter squat, but they're actually very different.
And is there any sort of last takeaways?
I'd just say that if you want to get faster, my line is always, show me your schedule. Like, does that reflect speed being a priority? And then just remember that as much as it is a physical output, we can time it, there's still a huge skill element. So there's a lot we've got to get right. And it's not, I think we take it for granted. It's really hard to do well. Therefore, I think we should be investing in it more, and as a result, we should be protecting it.